Hey guys, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to take a look at some of the key foundational poses as well as some of the key foundational concepts. So we're going to start with a brief talk and then get straight into the practice. So you'll need a mat and yoga clothes, and I'll see you on it. So come into a comfortable seat, get cozy for a second. We're just going to talk for a minute. So you can sit directly on your mat, you can sit in a chair, you can sit in a couch. If you want to use props to sit onto, blocks, bolsters, pillows, blankets, whatever you'd like to get comfortable. So I just want to talk a little bit about some key concepts in the yoga practice before we dive right into it. And the first one is Sanskrit, which is the language of yoga. And you've already heard a little bit of Sanskrit already. The word yoga itself is a Sanskrit word, and then there's a few other words that you'll probably hear me talk about again and again in the Sanskrit language. So the first one is asana, and you've probably heard this word before. Now, the original meaning of this word was a seat, or the thing you actually sat down in. And this evolved to become a seat of meditation, and then it evolved again to become the poses that we practice. So we're going to be practicing different asanas and looking at different poses as we go through this practice. And you'll notice that every pose has a Sanskrit name, and it ends in the word asana, as this translates to the word pose. So I'll mention them, and I'll always give you the English translation, just so you're able to become aware of what they are. And then another key word that you'll hear is the word drishti. And this means a focal point or a point of focus. And this can be anything. It can be a focal point on the breath as you move through the practice. It can be an intention that you have that's the focal point. But more often, it's usually what we point our gaze to, so a focal point of where you look. And this is really important in balance poses, to keep one single focal point so that you don't wobble all over the place. But if you have that set drishti, then you'll be able to find balance better. And then I also want to briefly talk about some things on an anatomical level, so that I'll talk about these over and over again throughout the practice, just so you have a basic understanding of what I mean when I say these things. So the first real major concept is spinal neutrality. And this just means that we want to create a neutral spine in just about every pose we practice. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, we really want to have neutrality within our spines. And neutrality, contrary to what most people believe, is not like stick straight spine, but our spine actually has 4 natural curvatures. The first curve occurs in the neck, and it's an inward curve or a concave curve. The next one occurs in the upper and middle back, and it's an outward curve. Then the lower back again curves inward, and the very bottom of the spine curves outward again. So if you look at it from the side, the spine makes a very gentle S shape. And we want these curves because they're very important to absorb shock, and they're there for a reason to protect us. So when I say things like elongate the spine, or lift up through the crown of the head, or lengthen your tailbone down, I'm creating these actions so that you can find spinal neutrality. And we want this very often in the practice. And I'm going to remind you about this time and time again, but we can just take a quick look at it right now. So find a comfortable seat. Wherever you are sitting is totally fine. And relax your sit bones down into whatever you're sitting on, the floor, a chair, a couch, whatever it is. And then counter this by lengthening and reaching the crown of your head up toward the sky. Align your ears directly over your shoulders, and align your shoulders directly over your hips. And allow for this action to find space between each bone of the back body, so you really create length through your whole spine. And you'll notice here that as you lengthen the back body, you can feel these gentle curvatures all the way down the back, and you can even place your hand back and feel them to create that soft S shape. And you'll notice here that your breath can become really full and relaxed. You give your lungs and your diaphragm, these respiratory muscles, the capacity to move to their maximum extension, so you can really find these deep, full breaths. Returning back to this concept, when you focus on the breath, you can really come into the present moment. So finding spinal neutrality is super important in the practice. It'll help to keep your spine safe, and it'll help to make your breath become fuller, which is really a huge aspect, a huge focal point of the practice. So the next thing I'd like to look at is core integration. And you'll hear me say this a lot as well. Activate the core, gather the core, use the core. finding all of these words to really stimulate and work the core. And the core is this belt of musculature around the torso. And this is what's going to really support and stabilize the whole torso, specifically the spine, and then it's going to stabilize the rest of the body as well. And we really want to have a strong and active core as we move through the practice. Now, to integrate the core, we want to focus on 3 actions. Now, the first action, and you can do this again in your comfortable seat, is take your hands to your frontal hip points. And this is going to be a bony protrusion. It's like a little bump sticking out from your pelvis. And you can feel them on either side of the hips. And these are your frontal hip points. And I'm going to refer to these quite a bit during the practice as well. So just notice where they are. And now imagine that there's a drawstring around them, and energetically draw those frontal hip points toward each other. Now it's going to be a very subtle movement. You're not going to see much movement in your body. It's more energetic than it is muscular. But it's the action of drawing these frontal hip points toward each other. And then take your hands to your natural waistline, and if you kind of bend from side to side, this will be the smallest part of the waistline. And think about energetically cinching in around the waist as if you're tightening a corset around the waist, hugging in around the midline. And then take your belly button and draw it in toward your spine and up toward your rib cage. So when you work these 3 points simultaneously, you're going to activate and integrate the entire core. And this will help to protect you as you flow through the practice. We always want to have a really strong, stable core so we can move from this place of stability. So I'm going to remind you about this again as we flow through the practice, but just keep this in mind. The way to integrate the core, draw the frontal hip points toward each other, cinch in around the waistline, and draw the belly button in and up towards your rib cage, working these 3 actions in conjunction with each other. And they're all subtle movements. When we work with these small muscles, we're really working with subtleties in the body. It's not going to be a huge movement that you can see, but it's more energetic. And then finally, we're going to talk about shoulder integration. The shoulder joint is the most mobile joint in the body, which is great for us because we can move it around a lot. We can grab behind us and reach for things. We can reach up, do all these awesome movements that we need in our daily lives. But when we work in the yoga practice, we do a lot of weight bearing in the arms. So we're going to place our hands on the floor and hold the weight of our body in the arms. So when we do that, we want to use less mobility and more stability. So to stabilize this joint, you can do this with 4 actions. And I'm going to turn to this side so you can see. Again, we're going to do this just in our comfortable seat. And take your hands forward in front of you. Flex into your wrists as if you're pressing against the floor. Spread your fingers wide. And just have your hands be in line with your shoulders. And just soften and relax your shoulders and away from your ears. So you're just in a soft, relaxed position to begin. And from here, on an inhale, press your hands forward in space until you round through the upper back. And you're kind of drawing the upper arm bone out of the socket here. So you're actively pressing away from you. And then keep this, but counter it by drawing your upper arm bone back in toward the shoulder socket. So you're working opposite energies here. Energetically, draw your hands in toward the midline, so suctioning in toward the center of your mat, the center of the body. And keep all of this, and very subtly broaden through your chest as if your collarbones are smiling. And while you do all of this, maintain your spinal neutrality, lift up through the crown of your head. And so there's a lot of actions happening here, but all the muscles around the shoulder are working now to stabilize this joint. And now you can put pressure and weight into the arms. So we're going to work with this a lot in the practice as well, and I'll come back to it and remind you many times. But again, the way to stabilize the shoulder, 4 actions. Press forward and simultaneously draw the upper arm bone back into the socket. Energetically draw the hands into the midline and very subtly broaden through the chest. And all these actions will help to keep the shoulder joint stable when we start to put weight into it. Okay, so finally I'm just going to give you some brief practice tips that we'll come back to again and again during the practice. And these are just general concepts to keep in mind that kind of apply to just about every single yoga pose. So the first one is this action of muscular energy. And we've been working with this already. This action of drawing in on the muscles, activating the muscles, and hugging muscle to bone to keep stability and to also protect joints. So we just talked about it with the shoulders, protecting into the shoulder joint by activating all the muscles surrounding it and finding stability and integrity within the core to move from this place of stability so that we can move with fluidity and strength. And then the next thing we're going to talk about is this action called root to rise. And so we've worked with this already when we found spinal neutrality, where you ground it down through the sit bones and then lift it up through the crown of the head. So the more you press down, the more you can lift up. And this is going to come into play over and over again through many different poses. The more you root, the more you can rise. So this other action is called counterbalance, which we've just been working as well. In the same root to rise, that you work opposite energies. And we did this in the shoulder where we pressed forward and then drew back, and you're countering these actions, but they're both working against each other. So equal and opposite energy. And this is going to come into play in so many different poses. So now that you know all these key foundational concepts, we're going to jump straight into the practice and look at some foundational poses so you can really get on your feet and moving in the practice. So we're actually going to begin seated again in a simple position, so any way that you feel comfortable, and always feel free to use props as you wish to sit on top of. So the more you elevate your hips, the more you can find spinal neutrality, the more you can relax the hips, and ideally you always want your knees to be below your hips. So if your knees are lifted up higher, then elevate your hips, and this will help you to relax the knees down toward the floor. So take a moment and get comfortable, and lift and lengthen up through your whole spine. Ground your sit bones down into the floor, lift up through the crown of your head, as if someone has a string pulling up on the crown of your head, drawing you taller in your own body. Keep your shoulders soft and relaxed, and try to align the back of your skull with the back of your pelvis. And work to find that spinal neutrality, maintaining the gentle, soft curvatures of the spine. And then from here, take a moment to close your eyes and just start to soften into your body. Take notice of any sensations that you might be feeling. Any places that you might be holding onto tension. And just notice, take inventory of what's going on. And then start to listen to your breath. Notice its natural rhythm. Notice its cadence and its depth. And we're going to begin with a little practice called pranayama, and this is Sanskrit for breath work. So as we talked about how the breath can ground you and bring you into the present moment, and this is exactly what it's intended to do. So we're going to begin with a breath called Ujjayi breath, and this translates to victorious breath. It's sometimes referred to as a warming breath or oceanic breath. So to do this, take your hand and place it in front of your face, and take a full deep inhale through your nose, and exhale, open your mouth and sigh it out. Inhale through your nose. Exhale out your mouth. And continue breathing in this way. Imagine that your hand is a mirror in front of you, and you're trying to fog up this mirror with your breath. In through the nose, out through the mouth. And just notice the warming sensation that this creates on your hand as you work to fog up this imaginary mirror. Now on your next breath, breathe in through the nose. And this time, close your mouth and exhale, sigh it out of your nose. Again, breathe in through the nose. And exhale, sigh it out your nose. Continue breathing in this way. Now still imagine that your hand is a mirror that you're trying to fog up with your breath. And still feel that warming sensation that your breath creates against your hand. Notice how this action of creating the sound through the breath, this fogging up of the mirror, the warming sensation, creates a subtle constriction in the back of your throat to allow for just a little bit of air to come through the gateway of your throat, of your windpipe, to create this warming sensation, and to give your breath sound to create an audible quality. And some people equate this to the sound of waves, which is why it's often referred to as oceanic breath, that sound of the gentle ebb and flow. And some people equate this to Darth Vader's breath. So choose whichever analogy suits you. And when you start to feel comfortable with this breath, you can relax your hand down, back towards your lap, and continue to breathe in this way, in through the nose and out through the nose. And try to elongate each breath so that your inhales and exhales are of equal length. And work with this slow, steady rhythm. And try to keep your breath the drishti, or the focal point of your practice. So that wherever your body may go, your breath will remain consistent, providing you with this slow and steady beat to follow. And from here, you can gently flutter open your eyes. And you can come onto all fours on your mat. So the next pose that we're going to look at is called child's pose, or balasana. So from here, you can bring your big toes to touch, and there's a few options for this pose, so I'll show you the classic variation first. Bring your big toes to touch and bring your knees to touch, and then just relax your seat down to your heels, stretch your arms forward, and surrender your forehead to the floor. And just soften your whole body, let everything become heavy. Feel a rounding through your back as you stretch and lengthen out through your fingertips. Let your shoulders become soft. Now this pose is often used as a resting pose, and just so you know, that is always a welcome option throughout our practice together. And if you go to take any yoga classes, this is always a welcome pose to come and rest into. If you ever need a moment to just catch your breath or return back to your focal point of the practice or whatever you need to do, this is a great place to come and relax and let go. So if you'd like to take some variations of it, you can walk your knees out as wide as your mat, and again, relax your seat to your heels. You can stretch your arms forward, soften your forehead to the floor. If you'd like to soften deeper into your shoulders, you can relax your arms down by your feet with your palms facing up to the sky. Now this pose is very soothing and relaxing. It places your spine back into what's called the primary curve, which is the same shape that your spine is in when you're in the womb. So it's this really relaxing place where you can kind of curl in on yourself and just surrender. Now, for many people, this might not be so comfortable, and that's totally okay. So if this pose doesn't work for you, you can always place a blanket underneath your knees to relieve some of the pressure pressing down against your knees. If it feels like too much of a stretch into your ankles, you can roll up a blanket and place it underneath your ankles to relieve some of the stretch there. If it's too deep of a flexion, too much of a bend into your knees, you can always place pillows, blankets, anything between your heels and your seat to relieve some of that bend into the knees as you fold forward. And then if you'd like, you can also place pillows or blankets between your chest and your thighs as you surrender forward. So do whatever you want to make it super, super comfortable. This is a place where you want to relax and surrender, so this should feel good for you. So this is child's pose, or balasana. It's a really relaxing, restorative posture that's great to use whenever you need a moment of rest in your practice. So next we're going to look at one of the really foundational poses called mountain pose, or tadasana. Come to stand at the top of your mat. So there are a few options for this as well. So the first option I'm going to offer is to bring your feet to be hip distance apart. And remember, we found those frontal hip points, those bony protrusions that come out of the front of the pelvis before. This is where you want your hip distance to be. So you want to measure the space from that hip point all the way down to your feet, and this is going to be about hip distance apart. A great way to measure this, if you want, is usually for most people, it'll be about 2 fist distances between your feet. So from here, lift all 10 toes and spread them as wide as you can, really trying to create space between the toes. And then very slowly lower one toe down at a time Ideally trying to see the mat between each toe, trying to create a very large surface area, a strong foundation for you to stand on. And then ground down evenly, press down firmly into all four corners of your feet. So you really create this strong, stable foundation. Energetically, draw your shin bones toward each other. Hug them into the midline. So there won't be movement, but it's an action of hugging in towards center. And then activate your legs by lifting up on your kneecaps. Feel the engagement of your quadriceps, the muscles on the front of your thigh. But try not to hyperextend the knee. Don't lock out the knee, but keep a micro bend even as you activate and lift up. So a micro bend is just a very tiny little bend into the knee or into any joint. So you don't lock out the joint, but you maintain muscular engagement, that muscular energy around the joint to support it. So lift up on the kneecaps, feel the activation of your quadriceps, and then you can take your hands to your hips and do just a couple of tilts of the pelvis. So first, stick your butt back behind you and feel an overarching of the lower back, and then tuck your tailbone underneath until your lower back starts to almost round. And then go back and forth a few times, sticking your butt back and tucking the tailbone under, moving back and forth. And then stop somewhere about halfway in between when you find your own neutrality. So you don't want to be too far back, you don't want to be tucking the tailbone too far under, but you want to find neutral. So somewhere halfway in between where you feel this stability. And then integrate your core. Draw your frontal hip points toward each other. Cinch in around your waistline as if you're tightening a corset around your waist. Draw your belly button in and up towards your rib cage, and let this be an action only stemming from the belly. So if this action draws your shoulders up towards your ears, then relax up here and just let the belly button draw in and up. So there's strength, but a sense of softness here as well. And then ever so slightly roll your shoulders down the back, relax them down away from your ears, and stretch the crown of your head up toward the sky. So again, imagine you have a string drawing up on the crown of your head, so it makes you grow taller in your own body. And you can look straight forward in front of you, keeping the shoulders soft, the arms relaxed. And so there's strength, everything is energetically drawing up as you simultaneously press firmly down against the floor. So it's an action, root down to rise up, this counterbalance of energy. And this is mountain pose or Tadasana, and it's said to be the most foundational posture. That every muscle in the body is active and engaged. You can spread your fingers even here and really activate through the hands. So you feel strength, but there's a sense of ease and softness. And it's kind of like the most beautiful analogy to the whole yoga practice. There's this sense of strength, but also grace and softness. So this is a version of mountain pose. If you prefer, you can walk your feet to touch and bring your big toes to touch, ever so slightly draw your heels apart, and work all the same actions. Spread the toes apart, energetically draw your legs to the midline. Lift up on your kneecaps, neutralize your pelvis, integrate your core, lengthen the spine, soften your shoulders, and find the energy here. So you can choose, whenever we practice mountain pose, you can choose whichever variation feels better for you, either feet together or feet hip distance apart. This is totally your option. And this is said to be the basis of every single pose in the yoga practice. So it's said that in every pose you can find the same elements of this posture, all the same engagement and strength. So the next pose we're going to look at is a standing forward fold called Uttanasana. So to come into this, again, your feet can be together or hip distance apart, whichever you like better. Draw your hands to your hips. Draw your elbows toward each other, expand your chest forward. Now maintain this integration of your core. Bend into your knees and keep spinal neutrality, length through your spine as you lead with your chest and fold forward over your legs. Relax the weight of your head down, and you have a few options here. You can soften your hands to the floor, or you can take your hands to your shins. You can also take your hands up onto blocks. And again, if you don't have blocks, you can use water bottles, a stack of books, whatever you have at home. You can draw your hands to your thighs and focus on elongating through the spine. So we have a tendency here that people will always want to reach toward the toes, and if your hamstrings, the back of the body, isn't quite so open, then you'll find yourself rounding through the spine and reaching forward. And again, we want to try and find spinal neutrality as much as possible. So you're much better off taking your hands to your thighs, lengthening your tailbone behind you to stretch the crown of your head forward. And then you find that neutrality within the spine, length through the back body without over-rounding, overarching, and straining the lower back. So instead, keep the knees bent slightly or deeply, however you'd like. Stretch your tailbone behind you and lengthen the crown of your head in the opposite direction. Expand your heart center forward in space. And maintain integration of your core, hip points drawing toward each other, belly cinching in and belly button drawing in and up. Keep the shoulders soft and relaxed, and take your hands wherever is appropriate for you. Now, if you're at the point where you feel like you can fold fairly deeply, you can relax the weight of the head and neck down. And of course, you're going to reach this point where you do find some rounding through the back. And that's okay if you're deep enough into the pose, but you don't want to round through the upper back. The round will come mainly into the lower back as you stretch your heart forward and down. So work with whatever variation of this pose feels good for you. Now, your knees can be bent a little or a lot. If it feels appropriate for you, you can start to straighten and extend through the legs. Find whatever variation feels most comfortable to you. So this is Uttanasana, or a standing forward fold. And it's a great stretch through the whole backside of the body, mainly into the backs of the legs, particularly into the hamstrings. And it feels nice as you traction the head down toward the floor to lengthen the neck, allowing the weight of gravity to just push you forward down toward the floor so you can completely traction through the whole spine. And surrender here. So this is Uttanasana, or your standing forward bend. So from here, you can bend deeply into your knees, plant your palms against the floor, and step your knees back. So we're going to find tabletop position, or all fours. And to do this, take your hands the same distance as your shoulders, so directly underneath your shoulders, and take your knees directly underneath your hips, hip distance apart. So spread your fingers wide and evenly space between them. Press down firmly into all four corners of your palm and very gently grip at the mat with your fingertips as if you're a cat clawing at the mat. So this will create a little suction cup. The center of your palm will gently lift, as well as the knuckles will gently lift away from the floor, creating a really strong, stable foundation to rest on top of, and this will help to protect your wrists and keep them safe. Now, because we're now weight-bearing in the arms, ever so slightly, we want to integrate into the shoulders, as we talked about before. So to do this, energetically press the floor away until the upper back rounds. And then ever so slightly, hug your upper arm bone back in toward the shoulder socket. It's going to be like a very subtle movement of your body becoming an elevator reaching down toward the floor. And then energetically, draw your hands in toward the midline, so there won't be movement, but it's an action of drawing into the center. And very subtly, broaden your chest, as if you're making your collarbones smile. Now, keeping your hips aligned directly over your knees, stretch your tailbone toward the back of the mat, and send the crown of your head forward, so you create length and neutrality through the spine. Integrate your core here by drawing your frontal hip points toward each other. Cinch in around your waistline and hug your belly in and up, maintaining stability. Now coming back to the arms, ever so slightly, externally rotate your upper arms. So roll the biceps toward the outer edges of the mat. This will make the eye of your elbow start to point more forward. And then counter this, working the opposite action by rotating your forearms toward each other, hugging toward the center of the mat. So working these equal and opposite actions. Finding length through the whole spine, strong stability into the arms, strong engagement through the belly. And you can energetically draw your knees toward each other and then counter this by simultaneously drawing your shin bones toward the outer edges of the mat. So you find stability and strength within the pelvic girdle as well. And really stretch the crown of your head forward so that your neck is in line with the rest of your spine. Now this is tabletop position, sometimes called all fours, and it's a really strong foundational pose of weight bearing. So anytime that we take options such as plank, you always have the option instead to lower your knees to the floor and come into tabletop, because as you can tell already, you really are strengthening through the arms here as well. So that is tabletop. Now the next pose that we're going to look at is plank pose. So it's going to be all the same foundational elements that you just worked here. So when we come into plank, we want to have all the same actions through the arms, the integration of the shoulders, pressing the floor away, rounding through the upper back, drawing the upper arm bones in toward the shoulder sockets, energetically hugging the hands in toward the midline, and ever so slightly broadening through the chest. Now keep your fingers spread wide and evenly press down into all four corners of your palms. And then we want to work that same rotation through the arms. So an external rotation through the upper arm bones so that the eye of your elbow starts to roll forward. And then you want to work the opposite action in the forearms, an internal rotation so that they roll toward each other. So you're countering each action against each other. So it's equal and opposite energy in opposite directions. Now maintain the length that you created through your spine. Stretch the crown of your head forward and maintain the activation of your core, hugging the belly in and up. And from here, tuck all 10 toes underneath and lift your knees up off the floor. Walk your feet back so that you can create a straight line from the top of your head down to your heels. Now energetically kick back through your heels and energetically draw your legs into the midline, squeezing toward each other. Keep actively pressing the floor away so that you create this rounding through the upper back. Draw the belly in and either align your hips with your shoulders or ever so slightly draw them below. So if this feels a bit too intense, you have the option to lower one knee down or both, coming back to your tabletop position or a modified plank where the knees will be slightly behind the hips, and maintaining the same activation through the arms, this strong energy to stabilize and integrate the shoulders. Maintaining activation through your core and stability and strength through the spine. Now, in plank pose, you'll tend to see people that will have relaxed hands. We have a tendency to lift up through the index knuckle mound, and this can place a lot of pressure onto the wrist. And this is the same for tabletop position as well. So you want to focus on that foundation. Fingers spread wide, pressing firmly into all four corners of the palms. Ever so slightly gripping at the mat with your fingertips. So find the foundation to then work all the way back up. Maintain the activation of your shoulders, and then in plank you'll also see often we have a tendency, especially when we start to get tired or when we don't have a super strong core, to let the hips sag down. And this can put a lot of pressure on the lower back. So you want to maintain strength through the core, drawing the belly in and up, pressing the floor away so that the hips stay either slightly below the shoulders or right in line with them. And if you're not able to do this just yet, keep one knee or both knees down to stabilize and maintain length and safety within your spine. So if you notice that when you begin to start weight bearing in the hands that you feel a little bit of pressure and discomfort in the wrists, you have a few options to take some of the weight off of it. So the first option is to make fists with your hands and rest onto fists. Now this will remove the angle in the wrists and apply much less pressure there. So this is a great option for both tabletop and plank pose. Another option you have always is to lower your forearms to the floor. And to do this, you can take a hold of opposite elbows just to make sure that you're exactly shoulder width apart. Your elbows are directly underneath your shoulders. And then you can do the same options. Bring your forearms parallel, spread the fingers wide. If you prefer, you can take your hands into like a prayer position, or you can interlace the fingers. So you can choose whichever option feels best for you. And work the same actions in the shoulders. Actively press the floor away, plug the upper arm bones in, energetically draw your elbows to the midline, broaden through your chest, and you can do this in tabletop, you can do this in plank pose, coming into a forearm plank, finding the same actions, but applying a lot less pressure onto the wrists. So these are great variations that you can take as you wish. Now, both tabletop and plank pose are great weight-bearing positions, so you start to build a lot of strength in the upper body, as well as in the full body. You're really working the core, the legs, everything is working very powerfully to support and stabilize you. You're working the full body as a strengthening position. So next we're going to look at downward facing dog, and this is probably a pose that you've seen quite a lot. It's kind of the quintessential yoga pose. And we're going to work all the same actions that we've created in the hands. So hands shoulder width apart so they align directly underneath your shoulders. Fingers spread wide, pressing evenly into all four corners of the palms, paying special attention to this mound underneath the first finger. This is where we have a tendency to lift up. So you want to keep that part of the hand plugged down into the floor. Ever so slightly grip at the mat with your fingertips. Roll the upper arm bones toward the outer edges of the mat, creating external rotation in the upper arms. Internally rotate through the forearms. Pressing down against the floor, find that stability within your shoulder. And tuck your toes underneath. And I always like to start coming into a plank pose just for a second to find your length. And then without moving your hands or your feet, inhale, lift your hips high up toward the sky. So you have a few options here. You're welcome to keep the knees bent deeply and stretch your sit bones up high. Energetically expand your hands forward in space. Stretch your fingertips forward as if you're trying to stretch the fabric of your mat. And this will create lots of space for you to wiggle your tailbone up toward the sky. Keep that external rotation through your upper arm bones, and this will allow your shoulders to soften so your head can become heavy, reaching through your biceps. Draw the pit of your belly in toward your spine so you can elongate your sit bones even higher. Now you're welcome to stay here with the knees bent a little or a lot. And the goal here is to find an elongation through your spine. So make this more interesting to lengthen your back body than it is to straighten your legs. But if it feels appropriate for you and you feel like you have the space, you can start to straighten the legs as little or as much as you would like, maybe reaching your heels down toward the floor. And it's an action of reaching toward. They don't ever need to get there. This is totally going to depend on your skeletal system as well as on your level of flexibility. So it's an action of working toward. Again, you don't ever need to reach that place. So energetically stretch your hands forward in space. Allow this to lengthen your sit bones higher. Energetically hug your legs into the midline and create an internal rotation of your thigh bones. So you're rolling your thighs toward each other and then press your thigh bones toward the back of your mat. Isometrically, energetically draw your feet in toward each other and then use the same amount of energy to draw the feet apart from each other. So equal and opposite energy, counterbalancing. Stretch your hands forward, your hips up, and your heels back. So your whole body lengthens in opposite directions. So this is downward facing dog or Adho Mukha Svanasana. Now, it's a full body position for sure. There's definitely weight bearing, so you're building strength, but there's also a lot of lengthening, so you're really working to create space and stretch and create flexibility as well. Now, often there's a tendency to work to straighten the legs, and then what happens is, if we don't really have the space, we compromise by rounding the back. So as I said, it's more important to lengthen the spine to find that stretch and elongation through the full back body, to find your spinal neutrality, than it is to straighten the legs. So you can keep the knees bent as deeply as you would like to make that happen. Really focusing on lengthening your sit bones higher, stretching your fingertips forward so that you can lengthen through the back body and create that space. So downward dog is a very common pose in the practice. We'll return to it over and over and over again. So you'll have plenty of time to create space to stretch and lengthen through the body, to work toward deepening the pose as little or as much as you would like. And there's no rush to get to any end goal. You're not going to become enlightened if your feet touch the floor. It's just working toward creating more and more space in your own practice. These are the key foundational poses of the yoga practice, and we're going to come back to them again and again and again, and you're going to see them both within this program and in any yoga class you go to in your life. So come back to this video as many times as you'd like so you can really understand what's going on in your body, and I look forward to putting these into practice again in the next videos to come. So I'll see you then.